The conference room was packed. 20 people. My name was already on the screen behind my boss. Bold, centered. He didn't greet me or make eye contact. He just started talking. "I want to discuss a pattern we're seeing," he said slowly, letting each word land like a hammer. "A pattern of carelessness." My stomach dropped. 3 weeks ago I'd made a small error on a spreadsheet. Formula mistake. It was caught, corrected, and approved by him personally. Over. But the way he said pattern made it sound like I was destroying the company deliberately. He described my error in detail, expanding it, reframing it. He made it sound intentional. The room went silent. Someone cleared their throat. I felt heat climb my neck but kept my face blank. I didn't interrupt. I didn't explain. I just watched him enjoy the silence. When he asked if I had anything to add, I said no. What else could I say? The meeting ended with polite applause. As people filed out, no one met my eyes. No one said anything. That's when I understood. This wasn't correction. It was execution. And I was cast without consent. Back at my desk, the humiliation sat on my chest like a physical weight. Could barely breathe. Slack messages slowed down to almost nothing. Conversations dropped when I walked past people's desks. My coworkers were treating me like I'd already been fired, like I was toxic, like associating with me might damage their own reputation. I sat at my desk for a long time, just staring at my monitor, unable to focus on the work in front of me. Then something shifted in my mind. Question formed. Question I needed to answer. I pulled up the spreadsheet he'd criticized so thoroughly in front of everyone. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the version history, but I forced myself to trace it backward methodically. Timestamps, approvals, comments, every change logged and tracked. I was looking for something specific. I was looking for his approval. And I found it. He'd approved the exact version he'd just condemned in front of the entire team. The same version, same date, same file. His name was right there in the approval chain. Digital proof that he'd looked at the spreadsheet and signed off on it as acceptable work. And then, 3 weeks later, he'd used it to make me look incompetent in front of 23 people. I sat back in my chair and stared at that screen for a very long time. This wasn't a mistake on his part. This wasn't him misremembering or forgetting what he'd approved. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was a choice he'd made. I started saving everything after that. Not dramatically, not in an angry, obvious way. Quietly. Methodically. Every file. Every approval. Every email that might matter later. I created folders on my personal cloud storage. I started a spreadsheet of my own, documenting dates, actions, approvals. An email notification popped up while I was doing this. A calendar update for a meeting he'd forgotten to remove me from. The subject line read, "Performance concerns follow-up." I didn't smile. I didn't react outwardly. I just saved that notification and added it to my list. The office was loud around me. People laughing, talking, living their normal lives. But I felt completely alone, isolated in my own corner of the world. The silence in my head felt different now, though. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It wasn't despair. It was space. Empty space where my fear was starting to transform into something else entirely. Something patient. Something cold. The next morning he appeared at my desk friendly. He stopped by with a coffee and complimented my professionalism during the meeting. He said it was a learning moment I should appreciate. I nodded and thanked him. I let him believe the message had landed. But I wasn't the same person who'd walked into that conference room yesterday. I started paying attention to details I'd ignored before. Who he copied on emails. Who he deliberately excluded. How often he made claims verbally instead of documenting anything in writing. Making statements with no record, no proof. I noticed how relief washed over my coworkers when the spotlight moved away from them. They'd all experienced versions of this. At lunch, I sat alone and reviewed archived chats going back months. A pattern emerged. Not mine. He blamed different people for the same mistakes. He approved work and later claimed he'd never seen it. He contradicted himself constantly, but since everything was verbal, no one could prove it. That's when I decided. I wasn't going to fight back emotionally. I was going to document everything. When he walked past my desk that afternoon and paused like he expected me to acknowledge him, I didn't. I stayed focused on my work. That unsettled him more than anger ever could. I changed how I worked without announcing it. Every deliverable left a clear trail. Every approval was confirmed twice, once directly, once in writing. I started summarizing meetings in follow-up emails, neutral in tone, precise in language. Nothing accusatory, just facts. He responded with thumbs-up reactions. Never corrections. Never arguments. That told me everything. It meant he couldn't argue with what I was documenting because it was true. In a team meeting the following week, he referenced my mistake again casually. But I watched the room. Fewer people nodded than before. Doubt was creeping in. His story wasn't holding up. After the meeting, a colleague quietly asked for clarification on the process. I forwarded her the documented steps. His documented steps, with his approvals attached. Proof that what he'd described didn't match what actually happened. When she read that email, I watched her face change. Understanding. Recognition. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The silence shifted that day. It was subtle, barely noticeable. But it was there. The power was starting to move. He started testing me, pushing harder, trying to find a breaking point. He'd assign tight deadlines and change priorities midstream without notice, watching to see if I'd panic or complain. I didn't. I adapted smoothly, and confirmed everything in writing. The more composed I stayed, the more agitated he became. In meetings he'd interrupt me. I'd pause, let him finish, then calmly restate my point. People started listening to me differently. They started paying attention. They started writing things down when I spoke. He noticed. One afternoon, I caught him watching me from his office doorway, expression unreadable. He was studying me like I was a puzzle he needed to solve. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I just kept working. For the first time, the power dynamic wasn't one-sided anymore. He just didn't fully understand it yet. That night, I organized my files at my kitchen table. Everything. Email folders, documents, timelines, approvals. I created a chronological record of every significant event since he'd started managing me. Took hours. But it wasn't obsessive. It was methodical. I was building a house of facts. And fact houses don't collapse easily. Whispers reached me indirectly over the following weeks. She made that mistake. He had to step in and fix it. She's not quite at the level we need. The narrative he'd created was spreading through the office like a stain, like a virus, contaminating how people thought about me and my work. I didn't correct anyone. Not yet. Instead, I focused on consistency. Perfect work. Perfect documentation. Perfect calm. I became the person who was reliable, who didn't make mistakes, who could be trusted. Performance review season was approaching, and I could feel him setting the stage, preparing the ground for what he was planning. The setup was obvious if you knew how to look for it, and I knew how to look for it now. He was building a case for why I couldn't be trusted, why I needed to be managed more closely, why I might not be right for this role anymore. He requested a one-on-one meeting. I walked into his office with a notebook, blank on the surface so he wouldn't know what I knew, but full underneath with pages of dates, approvals, contradictions. Just in case I needed them. He talked about trust, about visibility, about how important it was that I feel supported by my manager. I listened without interrupting, without getting defensive, without giving him anything to work with. When he asked if I felt supported, I said yes. I watched his eyebrows lift. Just a fraction, a tiny movement that revealed his surprise. He'd expected resistance. He'd expected me to cry, to defend myself, to give him something to argue against or refute. He didn't expect calm. He didn't expect acceptance. That calm was the most powerful thing I could give him in that moment. It made him uncertain. It made him doubt his own narrative. I spent my evenings at my kitchen table organizing files, labeling timelines, cross-referencing approvals. Week after week I built my archive. It wasn't obsessive. It was meticulous, careful. I discovered edits he'd made after deadlines had passed, changes he'd later blamed on other people, modifications that contradicted his verbal accounts of what happened. My name appeared once in those records. Others appeared constantly. The pattern was undeniable if you looked at it. I saved copies in multiple locations. Home laptop, cloud storage, external drive, printed copies locked in a box at home. If he tried to delete or alter anything, if he tried to rewrite history digitally, it wouldn't matter. The truth existed outside his reach now, in multiple places, impossible to erase or modify. At work, he announced a new initiative and assigned me a supporting role, less visible, more blame-ready. The kind of assignment that positioned me perfectly for what he was planning. If something went wrong, I'd be involved but not in charge, responsible but not in control. I accepted without hesitation. I didn't protest or ask questions or express frustration. He smiled, thinking he'd contained the risk, thinking he'd made me small again, thinking he'd successfully positioned me for a fall. He was so wrong about so many things. During a presentation about quarterly results and project updates, a senior colleague asked a question tied directly to my area of work. Something about process approval and timeline and decision-making authority. My boss started to answer, then stopped. He looked at me. The entire room waited. I stood up and answered clearly, confidently, with data. Cited dates, specific decisions, approval chains. Everything documented, everything verifiable. The senior colleague nodded, clearly satisfied with the answer. He asked a follow-up question and I answered that too, with the same precision and clarity. My boss said nothing. He looked away. He looked uncomfortable. He looked like someone whose narrative was starting to unravel in real time. After the presentation ended and people started packing up their laptops, someone thanked me for the clarity. It was just 2 words, nothing dramatic, but it meant everything. It was the first moment when someone in the room chose to believe me instead of him, chose my documented facts over his verbal claims. I felt something shift inside my chest that day. Not victory. That would come later. Just the beginning of possibility. The first real indication that the power was shifting, that the momentum was changing direction. He tightened his control after that moment, probably panicking, probably realizing that his narrative was becoming unstable. More check-ins. More quick syncs. Random questions about my work that seemed designed to catch me in mistakes or inconsistencies. I documented them all. Every meeting. Every concern he raised. Every question he asked. I responded professionally to everything, always polite, always helpful. And I always followed up in writing to confirm what had been said, what had been discussed, what had been agreed upon. The written record mattered because written records were difficult to argue with later. He started contradicting himself constantly, saying one thing in a meeting, another thing in an email, something else entirely in a private conversation. I'd ask clarifying questions, always politely, always in writing afterward, to confirm which version was accurate. The contradictions stacked up like bricks. He was building his own prison, one lie at a time, one inconsistency at a time. He grew shorter with me, colder. His patience wore visibly thin. His frustration was evident in every interaction. But I remained steady. That steadiness unnerved him more than anything else could have. It's difficult to control someone who doesn't react, someone who stays calm regardless of the pressure, someone who simply documents and moves on. My performance review arrived in my inbox on a Wednesday morning. My hand shook slightly as I opened the email and started reading. Carefully worded. Lukewarm praise mixed with vague concerns. No specific examples. Just enough ambiguous language to plant doubt about my capabilities and my future with the company. I read it twice, then I responded with a calm, professional request for examples. What specifically was the concern? When did it happen? What was the measurable impact? Attached to my email. Comprehensive timelines, approvals, performance metrics. Everything documented and verifiable. He didn't reply for 2 days. I thought about that email constantly during those 2 days, wondering what he was doing, what he was planning. When he finally did respond, his email was defensive, emotional, accusatory. He claimed I was being difficult, that I wasn't a team player, that I was missing the point of his feedback, that I was being argumentative. I saved that email carefully. Every word of it. I didn't campaign for sympathy. I didn't hint to people that something was wrong, didn't try to turn anyone against him, didn't ask for support or validation. I let consistency speak for itself. I let my work and my documentation and my reliability do the work of shifting people's perceptions. Slowly, gradually, people began shifting toward me on their own. Not because I'd asked them to. Not because I'd manipulated them or influenced them. Because they noticed something. Because they started paying attention to patterns they hadn't previously recognized. They started copying me on threads they used to route through him. They asked me clarifying questions and seemed relieved, genuinely relieved, when I had the answers documented and ready. In meetings, I noticed a pause now before answers. People waiting to see if I'd weigh in, waiting for my perspective, waiting for my documented information. When I did contribute, they wrote things down. Not because I demanded authority or made grandiose claims. Because my words held up later. Because I never contradicted myself. Because I was reliable in a way that was becoming increasingly obvious. He noticed the change and tried to reclaim control by cutting me off mid-sentence in a meeting, by talking over me, by using his authority as manager to silence my voice. But it felt forced. The room went quiet when he did it. That silence wasn't agreement anymore. It was assessment. It was people evaluating what had just happened, what it meant, who was telling the truth. I remained calm, waited for the appropriate moment, finished my thought when invited, and moved on. I didn't build alliances. I didn't manipulate people or leverage connections. I built reliability. And reliability quietly rearranged power without anyone noticing until it was already done. He escalated publicly, and that's when I knew he was truly running out of moves. His desperation was showing. During a team call with about 15 people on it, he questioned my commitment to the company instead of questioning my output. It was subtle, but it crossed a line. He said something about whether I was really invested in the company's future, whether I cared about our mission. The room reacted before I did. Someone inhaled sharply. Another person shifted in their chair. A third person's face changed visibly. I answered without emotion, without defensiveness, without taking the bait. I referenced specific deliverables, deadlines I'd met, approvals I'd received. I didn't defend my character. I just stated facts. I recited what I'd accomplished, the work I'd completed, the value I'd contributed. Someone else confirmed my timeline without being asked. A colleague who'd worked with me on several projects just volunteered the information, spoke up to verify that what I was saying was accurate. My boss laughed too fast, tried to soften the moment, tried to make it seem like nothing had happened. But the damage was done. The moment had passed. He'd revealed his desperation, and everyone in that meeting knew it. After the call ended, I saved the recording and noted the exact timestamp. Pressure didn't make him stronger. It made him careless. Made him sloppy. And careless, sloppy people leave evidence everywhere. Leave trails that are impossible to ignore. I seriously considered filing a formal complaint with HR. It was an option. The path was clear and available. But I'd learned something important over the past months. Clarity doesn't always mean speed. I understood that truth revealed too early sounds like defensiveness. Truth revealed too late sounds calculated. Truth revealed at exactly the right moment sounds inevitable. I decided to wait for the moment when facts no longer needed framing, when the evidence was so overwhelming that anyone looking at it could draw only one logical conclusion. That moment would come. I could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. In the meantime, I kept producing work that was clean, visible, and impossible to misrepresent. Every success tightened the contrast between who I actually was and who he was trying to paint me as. Every project I completed successfully, every deadline I met, every piece of work I delivered made his narrative less believable. He was drowning in his own story, and the more he struggled, the more obvious it became that something was wrong. He mistook my patience for fear. That miscalculation gave me something invaluable: time. Time to let his version of events collapse under its own weight. Time to let the truth breathe. Time to prepare for what was coming next. I knew it was inevitable now. The dominoes were already falling, one by one, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. The internal audit was announced casually in an all-hands meeting, framed as routine, presented as a normal part of doing business. No one believed that. Everyone in the office felt it. The air changed. The office felt tighter, quieter. People stopped joking in Slack. People became more careful about what they said and where they said it. He reacted immediately to the announcement. Urgent requests for old files. Sudden intense interest in archived projects he'd previously ignored. Questions that came too fast, too desperate. I responded to everything exactly as required. Nothing extra. Nothing insufficient. Everything documented. My files were orderly, chronological, and boring in the best possible way. Clean. Verifiable. Perfect. I watched his hands shake slightly as he scrolled through emails on his laptop, watching him search for something. Leverage. An angle. Something that would prove I'd made a bigger mistake. Something that would overshadow what he'd done. He wouldn't find it because it didn't exist. The mistakes he was looking for weren't real. For the first time in months, he wasn't managing the narrative. He was searching desperately for leverage that no longer existed. Records don't panic. They don't make excuses. They just wait. The auditors asked simple questions that demanded precise answers. He relied on memory and tone and personality to convince them of his version. I relied on dates and attachments and documented facts. When our accounts didn't match, and they didn't because his was fabricated and mine was real, the room didn't argue. Pause. It waited. I didn't correct him unless directly asked. When I was asked, I answered cleanly and stepped back. I let the evidence speak. I let the facts exist without my interpretation. The imbalance became increasingly visible. Not because I pointed it out loudly or repeatedly, but because the evidence did. The contradictions were mounting. He stopped looking at me altogether. That avoidance told me more than confrontation ever could have. His story wasn't holding under scrutiny. The inconsistencies were piling up. The contradictions were too obvious to ignore. This meeting was fundamentally different from every previous interaction. No screen behind us. No spectacle. No audience except the auditors. Just measured questions in a small conference room. He sat stiffly, voice tight with tension, hands moving constantly like he couldn't keep them still. I sat grounded, hands folded on the table, breathing even and steady. I wasn't anxious. I was prepared. I was ready. Every answer I gave aligned perfectly with the record I'd already submitted. Every answer he gave required additional explanation, required him to backtrack or qualify or clarify. The gap widened with each question. His contradictions mounted. The logical inconsistencies accumulated. When it finally ended, no one said, "Thank you." We didn't exchange pleasantries. We left separately. The hallway felt longer than usual walking out. Everything felt heavier. I didn't feel relief yet, but I felt certainty. The end was coming. It was inevitable now. I wasn't in the room when other colleagues were interviewed, but I felt the shift afterward. The atmosphere in the office changed. People avoided him now, not out of fear but distance. Something final. Something irreversible. Conversations with me felt normal again. Easy. Enforced. People stopped being nervous around me. Later I heard fragments of what had happened during those interviews. The auditors had asked about processes, approvals, patterns. And every colleague's story aligned with mine because they'd lived those processes. They'd seen those approvals. They'd witnessed those patterns. His story didn't align because it was designed, not practiced. It was fabricated, not lived. I didn't reach out to anyone asking what they'd said. I didn't try to confirm details or influence the narrative. I didn't coordinate with anyone. Truth doesn't need coordination. It just needs silence and time to accumulate its own weight. The email arrived mid-morning on a Tuesday. Short. Carefully written by HR lawyers. Leadership changes under review. No names mentioned, but no one in the office was confused about who that email meant. His calendar cleared within hours. Meetings were reassigned to other managers. He didn't come in the next day. The day after that, his office was being cleaned out. Kept working. I didn't speculate. I didn't celebrate or feel triumph. Vindication doesn't require commentary. It doesn't need noise. It just requires presence. Showing up, doing the work, being steady while everything else falls apart around you. He asked to talk a week later. His voice on the phone was careful, almost unrecognizable. He mentioned stress, pressure, miscommunication. He wanted to clear the air, wanted to explain himself, wanted to somehow undo what had happened. I agreed to meet because I needed to hear what he had to say. We sat in the same conference room where the humiliation had started. The same table, the same chairs. But everything was different now. He spoke first. He talked about how hard he'd been working, how much pressure he was under from above, how maybe he'd handled things wrong, how he regretted it. I listened without interruption. When he finished, I thanked him for the conversation. I didn't agree. I didn't reassure him. I didn't absolve him or forgive him or pretend that words could fix what he'd done. I just thanked him for talking to me. Later, I documented the meeting in an email to myself, cataloging what had been said, what had been implied. Like any other meeting. Like it meant nothing. Like it was just another data point. Closure doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like refusing to rewrite reality. The review concluded quietly. The findings were shared with precision. No drama, no spectacle, just facts. Mismanagement, pattern blame, abuse of authority, breach of professional conduct, unfair treatment of direct reports. My record was formally cleared. Documented. Final. No announcement. No public apology. No grand gesture. Just correction. Just the truth. Written down in official language by people whose job it was to determine what was real and what wasn't. That was enough. More than enough. My name no longer carried doubt. The stain was gone. It had been washed away by evidence and time and the simple power of documented facts. His office was empty one morning. Chair gone. Desk cleared. Door locked. No farewell email. No explanation. No last words. The absence spoke louder than any memo could have. People glanced at the empty space as they walked past, then looked away. Work continued. It always does. The office felt lighter over time. Meetings shortened noticeably. People spoke more freely. There was less walking on eggshells, less careful navigation of who was listening or who might weaponize words later. The tension that had existed for so long started to dissipate. I noticed how much energy I'd spent staying composed, staying calm, staying vigilant. Mental energy, emotional energy. The constant effort of proving myself against accusations that had no basis in reality. Now that weight was gone. I could breathe easier. Not victorious. Not triumphant. Just unburdened. The lightness spread to everyone. People joked in Slack again. People stayed late without looking miserable. Work became what it was supposed to be, work. Not a minefield. Not a place where you had to constantly watch your back. My role quietly expanded again over time. Not as a reward or a gift, but because I was actually good at it. Visibility returned naturally. Trust wasn't announced. It was practiced day after day, in the small moments when I was reliable, consistent, and calm. I didn't mention the past. I didn't need to. The work stood on its own. My record spoke for itself. I didn't have to defend myself anymore because the facts did that already. The evidence had done the work. I archived old files one last time. email folders, saved documents, timelines, approvals. I organized them carefully and moved them into storage. Not deleted, just no longer needed in my daily life. The chapter wasn't erased. It was finished. Complete. The evidence remained stored safely, but it no longer lived in my mind every second of every day. Could let it go. I never raised my voice. I never demanded justice or threw anger around like a weapon. I never tried to humiliate him the way he humiliated me. I stayed calm. I stayed precise. I stayed patient. And the truth, given enough room and enough time, did exactly what it always does. Proved itself. The humiliation he created for me became the evidence that destroyed him. He built his own collapse out of lies and contradictions and careless arrogance. I just documented it. I just watched. I just waited. That's the thing about calm. It looks like weakness until the moment it doesn't. It looks like fear until the moment it becomes certainty. It looks like nothing at all until suddenly it's everything. I'm still at the same desk. Different person though. Different because I learned that silence can be a weapon. That documentation can be a shield. That the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to destroy you is to simply refuse to be destroyed. The rest takes care of itself. The facts take care of themselves. Truth, when given space and time, always finds its way to the light. And now, months later, I don't think about him anymore. I don't replay the meeting in my head or feel that old heat rising in my neck. The humiliation is gone, not because he apologized, but because I proved it was never deserved. My name is clear. My work speaks for itself. I'm promoted now, reporting to his replacement, someone who actually listens and gives credit where it's due. The office is different. Everyone is different. We breathe easier. We laugh again. And sometimes, late in the afternoon when I'm finishing up for the day, I think about how powerful patience really is. How documentation is the ultimate weapon. How silence, when wielded correctly, is louder than any scream.